Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the 2021 Architecture Around the World series, co-sponsored by St. Louis Public Library's Stedman Architectural Library and the St. Louis and Missouri Valley chapters of the Society of Architectural Historians. I'm Chris Impastato, Fine Arts Librarian and Manager of the Stedman Architectural Library. We're so pleased to continue this collaboration and to see all of you virtually tonight. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Peter Wollenberg. Peter is a trained architectural conservator who moved to St. Louis in 1989 and has run Wollenberg Building Conservation, LLC since 1992. WBC works on a variety of historic buildings, structures, and large masonry sculptural objects, and is now in its 29th year. Peter's projects include the Missouri State Hospital, the Missouri State Capitol, the Wainwright Building, 2 governor's mansions, and St. Louis City Hall.
Thank you, Chris and the Society of Architectural Historians for sponsoring this, and thank you to all of you who are attending. The Lustron Corporation was only in existence from conception to closing for 4 years. They only produced a fraction of the intended total number of homes, yet those funny, shiny metal houses with the square panels that seem to pop up in the middle of neighborhoods are perhaps the most recognized mid-century prefabbed house in America. The Lustron House is something of a beloved icon that might have fully achieved what it had set out to do had it been given more of an opportunity. In this talk, I will briefly give the history of Lustrons, their geographic distribution, and discuss the substantial concentration that ended up here in the St. Louis area. There's been a lot of interest in mid-century modern architecture with the end of the 20th century, and a lot of interest in Lustrons in particular. I'm grateful to all the sources available currently, and especially to Tom Bakersmith, the original compiler of the Lustrons in this area. This talk is a follow-up of one I did in 2004, and I'm really grateful to cell phone technology and the ease of now finding specific addresses. I was using paper maps and more or less guessing where the addresses were back then. A friend at a dinner party recently suggested that I could just use a giant, excuse me, a giant magnet on the front of my car. I may have to try that at some point. Another change from my talk in 2004 has nothing to do with technology, but with the pandemic. I was able to arrange a tour last time, which could not be done under these circumstances, of course. On the other hand, a lot more people can see this talk and from anywhere, thanks to Zoom. The genius of the Lustron is that it is a prefab house. The idea of prefabricated buildings isn't new, of course. Cast iron houses were conceived of in England in the 1830s during the booming iron industry, and actually shipped and built in Australia for the Victoria mining towns in the 1850s. In this country, small wooden prefabbed houses were shipped all the way around to California during the early days of the gold rush. But something more individualistic and more substantial was available commercially by the 1880s, with availability of great quantities of lumber and an established elaborate rail system to move it around. George F. Barber of Knoxville, Tennessee, was marketing pre-cut wood houses by 1889. Shortly after the turn of the century, the Aladdin Company of Bay City, Michigan, was mass producing and marketing complete homes that allegedly could be assembled by unskilled homeowners. I would love to have known how many actually tried that. Now, down the street from Aladdin was a company called Sterling Homes, which offered dozens of different mail order house kits by 1920. Thomas Edison, the intrepid inventor, even tried his hand at prefab housing with concrete houses during World War I, but there were few takers. Now, of course, the best known mail order housing suppliers in the early 20th century were rivals Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward from roughly between 1910 and 1940. All the successful mail order efforts were in wood frame housing, but prefabbed steel housing was experimented with by the Germans following World War I because of its severe housing shortages at that time. Artist George Moike and his colleagues at the Bauhaus designed a steel house that was displayed in 1926. It still exists in some version, and I'm not sure if this is a restored original or a replica. In this country, Buckminster Fuller proposed a version of his Dymaxion house by 1929. And the Strand Steel House and the Armco Faro House were both exhibited at the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. The Armco Faro House survives in the Indiana Dunes, and the Strand Steel House was moved to Wilmette, Illinois, and still existed as of 2008, although that's in some question at this point. Examples of early prefabbed enameled steel small commercial buildings include the L.W. Ray designed patented system that was used for the White Castle hamburger chain by 1928. Gas stations proliferating with the automobile were also quick to adapt this prefab metal panel design. Standard Oil, and this is an old Standard Oil station in the Shaw neighborhood of St. Louis. Standard Oil was one of their early eager customers. But according to Tom Fetter's 2002 book, The Lustron Home, it was publications like Better Enameling, published by the Chicago Vitreous Enamel Products Company, that pushed the advantages of enameled steel as the modern product of the future. A 1931 article by Guy Irwin presaged Lustron Homes with the title, "Porcelain Enamel Will Make the All-Steel House Practical." Enter Carl Strandlund. Carl was the grandson and son of an engineer. His father, Carl Sr., immigrated to the US from Sweden with his family near the turn of the century. He settled in Illinois and worked for the John Deere Company. The father is credited with perhaps as many as 300 US patents for farm implements or improvements to farm implements. Well, the nut clearly did not fall far from the tree because Carl Jr. eventually also became an engineer, apparently through correspondence courses, and also worked in the farm implement field. He worked eventually for the Oliver Farm Machinery Company based in South Bend, Indiana. He too developed over 150 patents while at this company, including a far more comfortable tractor seat and a much lighter and therefore more efficient and productive combine. His crucial development came when he was promoted to director of engineering for the Oliver Company, overseeing, improving, and coordinating manufacturing efforts at 4 facilities in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Iowa. The Oliver Farm Machine Company's revenues jumped 6-fold through his efforts to $120 million a year. Now, perhaps because farming implement sales were plummeting during the Depression, Carl Jr. moved on to other industries. He worked for Chicago Steel for a while before landing at B.F. Goodrich Tire Company. And again, being the innovative and creative engineer, is credited with developing a better tank tread in the late 30s, early 40s. This really put him on the map with the Defense Department. But his heart was really in steel, apparently because Carl moved on to the aforementioned Chicago Vitreous Enamel Products Company in Cicero, Illinois, outside of downtown Chicago in April of 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor. Chicago Vitreous, begun in 1919, was in the fabrication of enamelware business, that is pigmented glass fused onto steel. They supplied the steel enamelware for the burgeoning household appliance industries such as refrigerators, washing machines, and stoves. Modern, easily cleaned sanitary devices for the home. They expanded into steel enamel panels for architectural use, and by 1933, they had formed a subsidiary company called the Porcelain Products Company, specifically to market to commercial interests, including storefront modernizations, gas stations, and even theaters. In fact, the Porcelain Products Company trademarked the word Lustron as early as October 1937. Standard Oil had a contract with PPC to supply panels for their sleek new designs. I believe there's a different Porcelain Products Company today. All that came crashing down with the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, and all steel production started going towards the war effort. Manufacturing plants of all kinds were converted to the war effort, including Chicago Vitreous. They started making, among other things, armored plate for tanks. Carl Strandlund, new kid on the block, joined Chicago Vit in April of 1942, doesn't rest on his considerable laurels, but invents an improvement to the armor plate processing or manufacturing process. The existing process left plates somewhat warped from the heating and cooling, thus requiring manual hammering to straighten them out. He developed a quick cold flow quenching system for the plates and then put them under 2,500 tons of pressure, resulting in a flat, immediately usable plate. He saved 1 million man hours and 500,000 machine hours in 1943 alone. He was everyone's hero and promoted to vice president and general manager at Chicago in September of 1943. He also won Chicago Tribune's War Workers Award. The ceremony was presided over by Major S.C. Massari of the Chicago Ordnance Division and was broadcast on WGN radio on April 26, 1944. So once again, Strandlund is very much on the map as far as the Defense Department is concerned. He was already intrigued by the pre-war commercial architecture work of Chicago Vit and voiced the residential possibilities of that work in a 1945 speech to the Eastern Enamelers Club in Philadelphia. There's no reason in the world, Carl said in his speech, why we cannot use these panels directly on studs to form an integral part of the wall. Let's produce something far more distinctive than we have done in the past, something that will outclass in convenience and beauty the present plodding wood constructed homes. It's probably a good thing there were not a lot of carpenters at that meeting. And by the way, I assume attendees of that meeting were making more than fun enameled pins. Strandlund, ever the improver, redesigned the existing panel design used for shops and gas stations to be interlocking and weather tight with plastic seals, so they didn't rely on being nailed onto a wood frame. Instead, an assembly of panels could be bolted to steel studs. His 1945 patent application was granted in early 1947. However, it was a friend in the steel business, one Carl Rowland of Macomber Steel, that suggested screwing the panels onto steel studs that really made it all workable, screwing them with self-tapping screws. The working store model proved successful, and post-war business was about to boom for Chicago Vitreous. Standard Oil wanted 500 new gas stations, for example, and Kraft Cheese, the Kraft Cheese Company, wanted 52 new stores. There were just two problems. The government still controlled the steel supply as the war was ending, and non-essential structural work was still prohibited. And two, the construction focus of the government at that time was housing for millions of returning veterans. So Strandlund goes to Washington, D.C. to argue that gas stations and cheese stores are essential, He was told that Wilson Wyatt, President Trump's housing expediter, did not consider gas stations and cheese stores a critical need or a good use of their steel supplies, but housing was on the critical need list. And here is President Truman signing the Veterans Emergency Housing Act of May 1946, allowing the government to get involved in solving the large housing shortage for returning vets. This was a eureka moment for Strandlund, who said, in effect, well, duh, we have the ideal solution: inexpensive, quick assembly, maintenance-free, prefabbed houses that can be delivered anywhere in the country. Strandlund had a subsequent meeting with Harold Denton at the National Housing Administration with preliminary Lustron house plans in hand. And Denton, as it turns out, was really the man to see, because he had already had an interest and expertise in the feasibility of the self-constructed house and the feasibility of mass-produced housing. So he was very impressed right away and backed the idea. So the Lustron Corporation is born. Strandlund initially persuaded Chicago Vitreous to fund the design and development of a prototype house. It was built in the middle of a nursery in Hinsdale, Illinois, not far from Cicero. It has 2 bedrooms. It had 2 bedrooms and measured 31 by 35 feet and was called the Esquire. Wilson Wyatt was flown in from DC in October of 1946 to see this house and was apparently completely blown away. And it opened to the public in November of 1946 and was visited by thousands during the 6 months that it was up. But Wyatt wanted a total of 2.7 million houses by the end of 1947, and saw Lustron as a significant player in making that dream come true. Strandlund said for his part, he could produce 30,000 of these houses within that time frame if he had access to the right surplus war factory and a measly 52 million in government capital. Well, Wyatt wasn't able to convince the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government agency set up to loan money to businesses that were deemed essential to the post-war efforts. So he ended up resigning, but his successor, a guy named Frank Creedon, got Strandlund into the enormous surplus Curtiss Wright aircraft manufacturing facility in Columbus, Ohio. A loan of 12.5 million was conditionally approved in January of 1947, but it was only for 2 years and had a 4% interest rate, and also required that Chicago Vitreous guarantee the loan. Well, ultimately, Chicago Vitreous backed out because they were not in the housing business. And Strandlund decided to resign from the company with their blessing and created the Lustron Corporation himself on Halloween of 1947. So you're already getting some sense of the elongated time frame here. Wyatt wanted all these houses by the end of 47, and Strandlund has only begun the corporation, the Lustron Corporation, at Halloween of 1947. Strandlund also bought the trademark and some of the equipment needed to get started. The factory in Columbus built Navy Helldivers during the war, producing the first one in November of 1943. And just 4 years later, the Lustron Corporation leased the western half of the factory for its operations. Their half covered 107 acres, and that much was needed for the mass production methods for stamping out large quantities of enameled steel panels. With some initial government funding secured, the first $7 million was spent on some of this equipment, including the 600-ton press. They also had an 1,800-ton press as well as smaller presses. There were welding stations each wall of the Lustron house needed 50 welds. Each house reportedly needed over 16,000 welds. There were 3 types of enamel spray booths. There were drying ovens for all of these things. One house required over 3,000 pieces of to build. By the way, I just learned that a guy named Arnold Newman, who was a freelance Life magazine photographer, is responsible for this famous photograph. I just learned that this afternoon. So one house required 3,000 pieces, which included over 1,000 enameled pieces of steel. 200 of those were a different color or shape. 7,000 square feet of enameled surface inside and out. 14 different end uses for the enamel material depending on the environment that they had to withstand. In other words, the roof versus exterior wall versus interior ceiling and kitchen or bathroom. All of this, of course, took a lot of time and development and experimentation. Lustron came up with a very clever way of transporting all of these pieces onto a single truck. Marketing started almost immediately. There was a spread in Life magazine in April of 1948. I'm not sure if this is Life magazine or not. Inquiries poured in to the tune of 200,000, and display homes were built all over the country. Curiously enough, the first display home was built in New York City at 6th Avenue and 52nd Street in mid-April of 1948. 60,000 people saw it. Milwaukee and Washington, D.C. followed in May, Des Moines and Detroit in mid-July. The St. Louis display home opened at the end of July 1948, about where the University Club Tower is now on Brentwood Boulevard, for those who know where that is. Rain or sweltering heat plagued many of the openings, yet 30, 40, 50,000 people would end up seeing each house, each display home. And of course, each opening was accompanied by excellent press coverage in publications like the Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, the New York Times, Life, Fortune, and House Beautiful. Just an aside note, it was fortuitous that I should happen to find a copy of this cover of Life magazine, because I believe there might be a reference to a relative of mine in there. The prototype put up in the Hinsdale nursery was a 2-bedroom model called the Esquire. The Lustron Corporation planned several models, including the Newport, ultimately the Westchester, and the Meadow Brook, I believe it's called. The first was the Westchester. So you can see it is almost identical to the Esquire model. The only differences being the removal of the offset here and elimination of the swinging doors. Here's a larger version. So you can see all of the doors, except for the front door and I guess the broom closet, had sliding doors, which allowed for a much more compact design. There was a 2-bedroom version, the O2 model, which was the most popular, at 31 feet by 35 feet. And the 3-bedroom version, the O3 model, which is a pretty rare model, and was at 30, the footprint was 31 by 39 feet. There was also deluxe Westchester versions, which added a combination closed dishwasher, bedroom vanities, and bathroom or kitchen dinette pass-through. And it's my understanding that most people opted for the deluxe Westchester. These were priced at, for the 2-bedroom, The FOB price, the freight on board factory price, was $5,400. The selling price was $9,000. And for the 3-bedroom, the FOB price was $6,500 with a selling price of about $10,000. But of course, these prices were dependent on the distance from the Columbus, Ohio factory. So they varied a bit. They had quite a complex pricing system. So here's an example of the Westchester 02. And here's the 3-bedroom 03 model. This would be the street front view. And down here is the entrance or the gable end on the left here. But for young veterans and any young couple at the time, these prices for the Westchester were relatively pricey. And Lustron came up with the Newport model, a smaller and less expensive model that had fewer amenities. In fact, almost none. So here's the 2-bedroom version, and it was measured at 31 by 23 feet. So you'll see it has a combined living room, dining room. The windows are in plane, so there's no bay window. Kitchen slightly smaller. The storage area is in a different configuration. It also has we'll talk about this in a minute, a conventional heating furnace system. Bathroom has been changed, and then for the 3-bedroom model, again, the dining room and living room are combined. And one of the differences is the door is on the right for the 3-bedroom. And let me go back for a second. And here's the front entrance, and the door is on the left for the 2-bedroom. So here's a 2-bedroom on this 023 model. And the FOB price, the factory price, was $4,000 for these, and with a sales price range from $6,900 to $7,900. For comparison, the standard Levitt house being built on Long Island at the same time for the very same reasons costs at a minimum $6,500, but more typically $8,000. Although I've read prices that were even higher than that. Interestingly enough, there are only 24 2-bedroom Newports built across the entire country because they were sort of a late entry into the game. And only one 3-bedroom Newport has apparently been built, and that was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Great Bend, Kansas has the greatest concentration of these things. I don't know how many there are. Fortunately, I do not have an image of a 3-bedroom Newport because there's only one. Now, common to all of the houses are the aluminum picture windows with side casings or casement windows without a picture window here. 3-inch minimum foundation. I would think that would be a minimum. I think you'd need at least 4 to 6 inches, and practical application would mandate that in any case. The steel frame, which was the structure of the whole thing, was welded together to form all of the wall structures as well as the roof structures. The skin, interior and exterior, consisted of the porcelain steel enamel panels attached to the steel frame framing elements with self-tapping screws with plastic polyvinyl chloride strips compressed between the panels for weather tightness. And also in this picture, you'll see in the Westchester model, the standard flooring was an asphalt tile. And the roofs were also all made of porcelain steel attached to the steel frame, as well as the gutter that you see here. This is entirely made of porcelain steel, porcelain enameled steel. And in this somewhat fuzzy drawing, you can get an idea of how these were constructed with, here's the foundation, the floor slab, the inner skin and the outer skin attached to the frame, and how the roofing works with the ceiling and the 3-inch insulation in the ceiling. And not shown in this image was 1 to 1.5 inches of rock wool insulation as well. A colorist named Howard Ketchum, who had a 35-year color design corporate consulting business in New York City, was the go-to guy for choosing corporate color designs at this time. He designed the colors for the Lustron Corporation, and presumably he designed them to be the most appealing to the most likely customers. He designed 4 colors: this surf blue, this dove gray, maize yellow, and desert tan. Interior colors were described as being all neutral colors in all of the rooms except for the kitchen and bath. And unfortunately, I don't have any color images of the kitchen and bath, but the kitchen and bath options were blue, yellow, or pink. Now, what's interesting in this promotional photograph here is, aside from the smiling woman who is so admiring her steel walls that she had to put her book down, are the neutral colored walls, but also these all different colored panels on the window wall. I'm not sure that was really an option, but that is certainly something worth researching at another time. And of course, the equipment that came standard for a Lustron home, at least for the Westchester Deluxe models, were the famous built-in combination clothes and dishwashers by the Thor Manufacturing Company. So you only need one piece of equipment to wash your clothes, order dishes, and presumably not at the same time. These things apparently were so popular that they were sold in France, and you can see how elated the French people were over these things. Truth be told, apparently these things were not all that highly regarded by their owners for reliability. For heat, in the Westchester models, there was radiant heat coming down from the ceiling, and the furnace was located at the top of the wall in the utility room, at least in the Westchester models. In the Newport models, they were conventional forced air systems. And in the bathrooms, standard, well, not so standard, tub, sink, toilet, medicine cabinet, mirror, and towel bar, etc. The sink and the tub were all made of porcelain enameled steel at the Lustron factory. And these tubs were not a standard size, which required a custom press to make these things. And it was a major expense. It's not entirely clear why they chose to do that. And here in the utility room is the furnace, part of the furnace that is overhead. So a quick recap: we have the Newport models, the less expensive and almost entirely all 2-bedroom models except for one. The Westchester models, and the 2-bedroom Westchester model and the 3-bedroom Westchester model. Then there's the meadowlark. Well, this was supposed to be, or I'm sorry, the meadow brook, not the meadowlark. It was supposed to be a slightly larger version of the Newport, but according to Tom Fetters, none of these things, these models are known to exist, at least as of 2002. According to Lustron Corporation records, 2,680 homes were shipped by May of 1950. The figure of 2498 is the number that is most often cited as having actually been built, but Tom Fetters thinks that the 2680 figure is probably closer to the truth based on his survey of serial numbers. I'm not sure if we will ever know for certain. Homes are located in 33 states, including as far west as New Mexico. I guess you could call this west as well. As far north as North Dakota, as far south as Florida. 2 houses were built in Alaska at 2 different Army bases. And the 3 states that have the most are Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. At least as of December 1949, there were 307 houses in Illinois, and Ohio and Indiana are vying for second at 275 and 142 respectively. Again, as of December 1949, when Carl Strandlund documented this in a long detailed letter to editors of the press, trying to do some damage control. South Carolina, interestingly enough, at the time, is said to have just have 2. Texas was recorded as having 11 by that point, or I'm sorry, having 13 homes. But in Tom Fetters' own list, Texas only has 2 homes at this point. I'm guessing that at least 11 were demolished perhaps by 2002. Also, 5 are listed as having been shipped out of the country, and as my understanding, they were shipped to Venezuela. The greatest single concentration in the country was located in Quantico, Virginia at the Marine base. The armed forces obviously were aware of this new type of house and for their returning vets, and they, as they put it, put their money on the table, or put our money on the table. 60 of these things were built. They were apparently the most popular housing on base. They were rehabbed in the 1980s. The Army threatened to demolish them by 2004, and they did start demolishing them by 2006 and 7 after trying to get people to buy them at the cheap price of $8,000, disassemble them, cart them away, and rebuild them someplace else. Well, my understanding is that only 8 people took the Army up on their offer. So all but 2 of the rest of the houses did in fact get demolished. Per the list of known lustrons by state in Tom Fetters' book, there are 14 towns or cities in Missouri outside of the St. Louis area that had lustrons. Not surprisingly, Kansas City had the most at 14. Interestingly enough, Mexico, Missouri, someplace in this area, was number 3 with 6 houses, and Marshall and St. Charles, Missouri were tied for 4th at 3 each. The St. Louis region, of course, built more than the lion's share. These houses don't represent individual houses, but the general area where they're concentrated. So you can see that they were south, the north, the southeast county area, and over on the east side. And again, this is thanks to Tom Bakersmith's diligent work. The model demonstration home for St. Louis was built in July 1948 at 1100 South Brentwood Boulevard, where the University Club Tower is now. The dealership for Lustron in St. Louis was the Modern Housing Corporation, owned by Charles and Bill DeWitt. If that name may sound familiar to baseball fans, because the DeWitts owned the St. Louis Browns, and had, at least at some point, and had offices at 3011 North Grand Avenue or Boulevard, where the Herbert Hoover Boys and Girls Club is now, but where Sportsman Park stood until 1966. In 1950, the DeWitts moved their offices down to 2221 South Brentwood, or just north of where the Enterprise car rental lot is today on Brentwood. The manager for the Modern Housing Corporation was Fred Holtkamp of Holtkamp Lumber. Fred was Bill DeWitt's father-in-law, and I find it rather ironic that a lumberman was facilitating the construction of metal houses. By the way, Bill DeWitt Jr. became co-owner of the St. Louis Cardinals in 1996. His dad was never an owner of the Cardinals, but he was a treasurer in 1936. So the amount of inaccurate information regarding at least the number of Lustrons in St. Louis is quite interesting. For example, in a 1982 Frank Peters article in the Post-Dispatch, he stated that there were about 24 Lustrons in the St. Louis area. And in the fall of 1995, the Webster Kirkwood Times in the St. Louis area noted an article that the state of Missouri had finally started cataloging Lustrons and knew of 12 in the whole state. The write-up for the St. Louis Film Festival in 2003 or 4, featuring the Lustron documentary by Bill Kubota and others, noted that there were 3 Lustrons in St. Louis. But St. Louis and Tom Baker-Smith identified over the course of some 8 years, beginning in the early 90s, a total of at least 78 houses, including out in St. Charles, over on the east side, and off this map to the south, about half an hour in Crystal City. Esley Hamilton, St. Louis County Historian Emeritus, working with Tom's list, came up with some 74 as of 2004, including the outer burbs area. So the numbers are, well, fluid. Webster Groves, a streetcar suburb of St. Louis, had the most Lustrons at 21. It currently has 13. Brentwood was second at 14 and currently has 11. And St. Louis City proper had 9 and currently has 8. It is not surprising that real estate prices and housing trends would affect Lustrons heavily. Teardowns of all types tend to happen in higher priced neighborhoods. So it wasn't unexpected, and this is a map of the area of concentration within Webster Groves on the 2 streets of Baker and Simmons, where the houses were. So it is not, as I say, unexpected, though sad, to discover that on Simmons and Baker Streets, they lost 5 of the 7 documented houses on Tom's list. For example, this had been a Lustron as recently, I don't actually have a date, but I think this is a pretty recent house. This had been a Lustron on Baker Avenue. Simmons, this had been a Lustron not that long ago. And this is 224 Simmons, which had been a Lustron at least as of November 2004, which I documented. Interestingly enough, the owner at 224 Simmons tore down the Lustron and built on the double lot. His wife, I was told, grew up next door at 226, where that Lustron, which is over here, still exists in some form. And it is recognizable primarily, well, by the bay window and by the roof and chimney. But next door to that, at 228 Simmons, is a perfectly intact Lustron that happens to mirror the original blue and yellow Esquire model in Hinsdale, Illinois. And let's see, there's another view of that, including intact aluminum windows. And I thought that I had discovered a third Lustron on Baker Avenue. There's nothing distinguishing about this house except that it has what looks like a telltale chimney. But sadly, I discovered that it was built just a little too late in 1952, so it takes it out of the possibilities. Here are two other surviving Lustrons in Webster Groves, which I often abbreviate to Webster. And perhaps they survive because they are so well hidden. Originally described as being listed in Webster, there are 4 houses on Eldridge and Plateau Avenues that lie within what I believe are the boundaries of a Rock Hill. There are 3 Newport models in this area alone. You can see people have added porches to them because they did not come with any kind of porch. Across the street is another 2-bedroom Newport with its own version of a porch and awning. Around the corner on Plateau Avenue is this other 2-bedroom house, which in 2004 was its original tan color. And there were also 2 new Westchester models. One is hidden behind a beautiful pine tree, so I couldn't show it to you. And this one, which was owned by a young couple that bought it only 7 years ago and said they absolutely love it. After Webster, the suburb of Brentwood had the second highest number of Lustrons in the St. Louis area at 14. 8 of those houses are lined up on Litzinger Avenue alone. The conditions range from pristine to highly modified. This is 8914, and you can see the porches been eliminated, the doors changed orientation, the windows are changed, although the porch column and built-in gutter has remained in this one. 8924 Litzinger, siding of different kinds, windows have changed, but the window surrounds, original window surrounds have survived. At 8920, the window surrounds survive again, although the windows have changed. And the gable panels exist and the roof still exists. In 8934, the most distinguishing thing here is that tells you this is a Lustron is the bay window. They even changed the roof on this house, but again, the chimney is the giveaway. And there are 4 houses that survive more or less intact. This one at 2401 Annalee on the corner of Litzinger has its original aluminum windows and window frames and roof. This one at 8918 Litzinger is particularly important because it is one of only 2 houses in the area with a Lustron garage still. The other Lustron garage is in South St. Louis County. The house looks like this. The garage has been, I assume, moved to the back here. And the only way you can tell it's a Lustron is that the roof, the original roofing tiles are still there, although it's been painted white. Back to Litzinger at 8928 Litzinger. This house survives pretty much intact. The windows have been changed. The roof has been changed out as well. But 8938 Litzinger is probably the most intact street on the house, on the most intact house on the street. It has its original gable panels, original roofing, original windows, window surrounds, original column and downspout, as well as its original porcelain enamel gutter. Brentwood, unfortunately, has had a few losses, including on Lewis Avenue, which is just north of Manchester Avenue, kind of a hard street to find. 8520 Joseph Avenue was a Lustron not too long ago, and I can attest to the fact that 85 Genevieve existed just probably 2 or 3 years ago. And these two are in the same neighborhood, and the third street in this neighborhood is called Henrietta, which parallels Joseph and Genevieve. And this is the last remaining of the three on the 3 streets. And here's why, or here's why the other 2 are gone. Just 100 yards away, they are racing to put up large new homes that replace all of the 1 and 1.5 story homes from the 1940s. And finally, in Brentwood, near the Mid-County YMCA, is a rare 3-bedroom Westchester model. It is one of only 2 in the area. And this is the street front, and the entrance looks like this. So the houses in the St. Louis city proper, numbering only 8 now, are concentrated in the south and in the north. And in the north is Velda City, which was identified as Beverly Hills, which I think is maybe an adjacent neighborhood. And there are 2 houses on Woodrow Avenue. One is quite intact, and the other one is a little bit modified. What is unusual is here's a nice opportunity on this house that is more intact to actually see the back of a Winchester or Westchester model. Normally they're buried in a neighborhood. These houses, by the way, for people in St. Louis, are near St. Peter's Cemetery. And to the far south is 4848 Germania, which is just a few doors east of Gravois, and is again a rare 3-bedroom Westchester model. And this is facing the street, and you'll may notice that this is actually the back of the house. The normal street front faces the other direction, faces the river de Pere. And I'm guessing that view at the time when this was built was probably not what it is today, but we are now looking at the back of the house. This is the kitchen entrance. Here's one of the gable ends. You can see this poor house is in need of a lot of TLC. And here's a comparison of the Westchester 03 model in Brentwood with its street elevation versus the Germania one. So here's the chimney that normally is in the back of the house. So again, here's what's normally the street elevation, the gable entrance, and what we were looking at there is the kitchen entrance in the back. the front door for the Germania house is buried under all this foliage. And in between the north and the south extremes of the city lustrons are found in Tower Grove South area on McDonald. And this one is a bit more intact than this one, but generally they are intact. There are two on Marquette in what I believe is the Lindenwood neighborhood. And I think one of these is might be a B&B. Let me go back to McDonald for a second. I happened to get a phone call from the woman that lived in this house for a long time this afternoon. I thought was fun. So there's McDonald, Marquette, and also 6509 Marquette, which is next door or a couple doors down, which is this fascinating glazed block house from 1949, which I'm thinking is going to be a future talk. Also, towards South St. Louis is this house at 6552 Bradley, also in the Lindenwood neighborhood. Somebody interesting lives in this Newport model. It is one of the few homes that has been painted that I've noticed, including the roof. And it is also perpetually prepared for Halloween. And they are certainly prepared for next month right now. Perhaps this was to honor, here's my theory, perhaps it was to honor Carl Strandlund's founding of the Lustron Corporation on Halloween 1947. Just a hunch. The house that is maybe most recognized by St. Louisans is the one at Stanley Avenue in McCausland, because it's one of the most, it's on a major north-south thoroughfare. It unfortunately also needs a bit of TLC, but it features this lovely, very sensitive rear addition. Out west, or at least out near west, is a Lustron on Westview Avenue, buried in the woods and ravines of Sugar Creek, the Sugar Creek neighborhood of Kirkwood, which is west of the downtown part. And if you could look west now, all you would see, unfortunately, would be Highway 270. I'm sure it was a much better view back in 1949. The original owner, Tom Baker Smith, told me was a Lustron erector foreman for the Modern Homes Corporation, and he wanted a basement, which happened to be pretty easy to do because of the rolling landscape of this particular area. It is the only Lustron in the area with a basement, and perhaps a very rare Lustron in the whole country with a basement. And also a little bit further west in the community of De Pere, there were 4 Lustrons on Vineta Avenue, which is also an easy street to pass up, and also north of Manchester Avenue. And there were, as I say, 4 houses originally, and there are only 2 left, including this one, which you would not think was a Lustron except for the telltale bay window and the infamous chimney. And actually, I think the gable might still have its original panels as well. And the other house down the street at 1143 Vineta has been completely changed inside and out, and is owned by an interesting man who is a collector and a musician, and told me that he got to play with B.B. King once. This man's neighbor has lived on the street a long time and knew all about Lustrons. One rather unusual tidbit he shared with me was that Carl Lustron had purchased surplus battleships after the war and melted them down to make steel for the Lustrons. Well, that was news to me. If anybody can verify this, I have all ears. So the Lustron houses, the unusual Lustron houses, certainly attract interesting and unusual people. Even farther out west, there's Herman, Missouri, a friend of mine, an artist friend of mine, took these pictures, and I realized that they were also, that this house is also a 3-bedroom Westchester, and has its original porcelain enamel guttering. A little farther north and west in the city of St. Charles, which is about a half an hour northwest of St. Louis. By the way, this is the beyond part of my St. Louis and Beyond talk title. There are 3 houses in St. Charles city itself, and it's my understanding they're all owned by the same person, and they're all in beautiful, pristine condition. And this particular one on 6th Street even has a little description and history of Lustron Houses. In the rest of the area, in St. Charles County, which includes the city, there were a total of 4 houses. That includes these 3 in Jefferson County to the south. There were 2, and as I said, in Metro East, across the Mississippi River in Illinois, there were 11 houses. And to the east, there's a double Lustron in Raymond, Illinois, and I haven't been there, but this picture is courtesy of Tom Bakersmith. The second Lustron was built originally in Ellisville, a suburb to the west of St. Louis, and it was disassembled and purchased and moved out here, and now there's this giant 2 Lustron. And this picture must have been taken during the April of 2008 earthquake because of, what's going on here. And farther out west, farther out east rather, in Canton, Ohio, is the Top of the Mark Motel. Esley Hamilton, St. Louis County Historian Emeritus, gave me his whole Lustron file recently. This is the second piece of paper in the file. And I even actually called them up to confirm that it still existed and still had its metal panels and metal roof, etc. So can anybody say road trip? So what became of Lustron? So why did these well thought out, well designed, well regarded houses cease production in 1950 after only having started in 1948? There are a number of reasons, essential reasons, each with their own complex histories. But basically, number one, it never had the backing of the parent company, Chicago Vitreous, or its subsidiary, the Chicago Porcelain Products Company, even though they supplied much of the steel panels. Because Chicago Vit was not in the business of experimental housing. 2, the whole enormous capitalization plan relied on a huge government loan or loans with a short payback, which is quite dicey for a new experimental housing industry. And the huge scale of the operation, the idea that they're going to build 30,000 of these things required to fulfill the requisite demand of the government was quite risky an undertaking to begin with. And again, for a unproven experimental housing technology. And very expensive equipment was purchased and or custom designed to build part of that house, and it had no other use except for the one element. I'm thinking of the bathtubs, for example. When when that press wasn't building or making bathtubs, it had no use. Number 4, despite the company's marketing campaigns, bad press started to erode public interest. Congressional hearings were frequently in the news. Factory layoffs did not inspire public confidence either. And 5, Lustron leveraged endorsements from some very high-profile individuals, poorly chosen as it turns out. Senator Joe McCarthy, very well known in the country by 1950, was one such person. Traditional trade unions, particularly carpenters and roofers, felt threatened by all of this and used their clout to pressure Congress, which in turn pressured the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The RFC didn't take that much pressuring to start asking questions about where its public money was going and what kind of return it was really getting, particularly since they were supposed to be producing something like 100 homes a day, and they were maybe producing 30 at best. And there were lots of allegations of public corruption, which are detailed in numerous sources. So on February 22nd, 1950, the beginning of the end was sealed when a foreclosure suit was filed on the $31 million outstanding loan. Although I've heard that figure to be 37 as well. Congressional committees held hearings, debated getting into the housing business themselves. For veterans, decided not to. Several companies expressed an interest in taking over Lustron. By the way, here you can see Carl Strandlund attending one of the hearings. One of the companies that expressed interest in taking over Lustron was U.S. Steel and its subsidiary Gunnison Homes, which ironically produced wooden prefabbed houses. And apparently their production method was considerably easier than Lustron. Republic Steel was also a possible contender, but they didn't, but not in the prefab home market. And they were not in the prefab home market at that point. So receivership proceedings started on March 6th of 1950. By May 5th of that year, a judge approved the sale of the Columbus Lustron plant and all of its assets, including its patent rights. Carl Strandlund fought back with a letter in mid-June of 1950 to the Senate committee investigating all this, and stated that 8 months prior, Lustron had orders for almost 8,000 more homes. So those figures apparently did not persuade the right people. So finally, after many years of congressional hearings, court battles, and claims against the Lustron Corporation, the trustees of the estate of the Lustron Corporation, quote, petitioned to destroy all books, records, and papers which were stored in the Columbus, Ohio, and Chicago offices in February of 1960. Apparently, there was not much press or public comment at that point, not really surprising after long, protracted legal battles. And as Tom Fetters put it, sadly, it represented a mere blowing away of the dust of the corpse of a gentle giant. This is the cover of Bill Kubota's 2004 documentary. After Lustron, Carl and his wife Clara moved around. First they moved to Chicago, then they moved to New York City, then they stayed in Florida for about 17 years. And Carl did not quit inventing things. He created Strandlund Homes Corporation and started to develop plastic housing. And he has patents in 1962 and in 1966. He also did consulting work and even set up a plant in South America, presumably through his contacts in Venezuela, where I believe the 5 houses were shipped. Perhaps another road trip. In 1973, with Carl in failing health, the Strandlunds moved back to Minneapolis, where Clara was from, and he died in December of 1974 at the age of 75 and is buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Minneapolis. Clara lived another 14 years and died at the age of 96. So in conclusion, I would say Strandlund and his dream did not survive, but his houses stand and survive and many appear to be absolutely as intact as they were the day they were built. For additional information, there are 5 publications that I know of that talk about the Lustron home. The primary source to my way of thinking is still the Lustron home by Thomas Fetters, published in 2000 and 2002. And of course, there are hundreds of magazine articles and newspaper articles. In fact, the Ohio History Connection has a extensive bibliography of all of the periodical publications between roughly 1946 and 1950 and a few beyond that discuss the Lustron home. So that's available online. And of course, there are umpteen resources online, although you have to be somewhat careful about what are facts. And lastly, I want to thank the Society of Architectural Historians. Particularly, I want to thank Chris Impasato with the Stedman Collection at the St. Louis Public Library, Tom Bakersmith, who did all of the collecting back in the 90s and found all of these houses, Tom Fetters for his excellent book, innumerable other writers and researchers, Toby Weiss of Modern STL, Esley Hamilton, and of course, all of the homeowners who have kept these houses alive, and to you, the audience. Thank you very much.